Caroline, so has the Green Party got any plans for the general election?
Well, it's funny you should ask me that.
Forget that. I'm not doing that yet.
Right.
We might get there in due course, but thanks for the prompt. I guess I want to start with a couple of difficult ones to begin with. So when you hear those ideas which the Green Party is putting forward and would have wanted to see in the King's speech and will no doubt feature in one way or another in a general election manifesto, and you hear all of that and you think if we had citizens' assemblies around the UK, probably everybody, well maybe not everybody, but huge numbers of people would say, yeah, of course, obviously, that's obviously the way we should go. But it still doesn't work out like that. It still does not seize the imagination of enough people. Now, I know you might be tempted to say, it's the electoral system, stupid, isn't it? And I know that. But just dig a bit deeper, because Green parties in other countries are still finding it difficult to get the traction which we need to tip Green politics, not just into the mainstream, but into really strong majority positions. So they're suffering in Germany now. We've seen the result in the Netherlands, the wipeout of the Greens in Sweden. I mean, what is it about people that they can't buy in consistently to such transparently obvious, sensible, compassionate ideas to keep Green politics at the forefront of what we need to do? What's going on in the human brain that they're not doing this?
It's a very good question, and I hope you might elucidate that. I mean, there's a lot of unpacking that I think needs to go on in terms of trying to answer that question. And I'll come to some of the other countries in a second. I think what we have in this country is a particularly insidious national media owned by very few people with a particular agenda, and I don't think that is something that we should ignore. So I think that the idea that people are receiving kind of straightforward information about anything very much is sadly challengeable. And in this world of ever more fragmented media and social media, and we know all of the concerns around the different adverts that are pushed to you because of the algorithms and so forth, then it is very difficult for people sometimes to properly know what's going on. And you know, I think that's been shown in many ways. In terms of what's happening in other countries, and in Scotland, of course, is closer to home, and the Scottish Greens are in a it's not a formal coalition, but they are working with the SNP in the Scottish Parliament. And I just think it's incredibly hard, isn't it, when you're the junior partner? You know, if somehow we could have a springboard where you went from not being in government to suddenly having a majority, then you would have your hands on all of the relevant levers. I think it's immensely difficult when you're working with a more populist coalition partner who therefore has more power than you do, and therefore you're trying to work within the parameters that they set. And that can be really hard. And one of the things that it made me think about it just recently was, of course, over the whole debate about the ultra-low emission zone in Uxbridge, you know, which was the by-election that the Tories managed to hold on to against everyone's predictions because they'd made such a big fuss about Sadiq Khan's ultra-low emission zone. And the Greens have been very active on the London Assembly, arguing for ULEZ, but they would be the first ones to say there wasn't nearly enough money put into the scrappage scheme, so that when there are winners and losers, as there always are in any policy, there are winners and losers. I think Greens would say that in our policies there are more winners than losers, but nonetheless there will be some. Those losers in that particular case were not given the support that they needed in order to make that transition. So I think that's part of it. But I mean, this is a conversation. What do you think? Genuinely, I mean, I don't know what's happening. I know what's happening in terms of the figures in Germany, but I don't know what the analysis is of what's happening in Germany.
Yeah, I think I agree with you entirely that people are finding it really difficult to know where the the point of truth is about what's happening in the world today, and social media is undoubtedly affecting the ability of people to make judgments consistently over time about where the best bet lies for humankind in general. They really are. They're also swept up in a kind of crazy, endlessly seductive way of sort of thinking they're going to be happier through consumption, with Black Friday now as the kind of go-to moment of collective global insanity, where we're suddenly reminded, yep, that is what makes the world tick for so many companies and for so many individuals who think that maybe that's a little bright point in their life. It's hard to summon up the tragedy that in lives that are really difficult and hard-pressed and narrowed by virtue of living in political systems like ours, Black Friday becomes a moment of relief and upside. I mean, madness, but that's what's happening. And I think all of those things are compounded by the right-wing media. I mean, I think it's difficult to overstate the degree to which the influence of those media forces around the world have contaminated the political discourse, have clearly enabled a lot of very unfortunate right-wing neoliberal politicians to thrive when they shouldn't have thrived, because they've got nothing to offer less well-off people in society, and increasingly nothing to offer most people in society. So all of those things are compounding, as it were, making it increasingly difficult. But it's problematic, because in a way what we need is a point where the mainstream politics of this is seen to be so important to the future of humankind that everybody starts saying, yeah, okay, we know what you're trying to do now. You're just messing with us. Is this wrapped up with the inability of Labour to be a genuine opposition party? I mean, you'll never hear Labour challenge some of the revealed truths about a neoliberal economy.
No. I mean, hearing Rachel Reeves this morning, I lost count of the number of times she said growth, but more and more was just about the answer to everything was more and more economic growth was going to be the thing.
Yeah.
And you know, increasingly difficult is it now to say that on a planet of finite resources, if your growth model is one of more and more extraction and production and then dumping it the other side of the world, that model is simply not sustainable. And you know, when she says, well, that's the only way we're going to get the money to invest in public services, I don't know about you, but I was shouting at my radio saying that is not true. There is a whole raft of policies out there around redistribution if you wanted to use them, but you have chosen not to do that. So yes, I think you're right in the sense that to the extent that official opposition parties are not putting this forward as an obvious, logical part of the conversation, it gets deemed to be somehow extreme or unmainstream and therefore unserious.
And prejudicial to your prospective vote.
And indeed, exactly that. So it feels as if the whole centre of gravity is being pulled further and further to the right, and you know, the so-called Overton window of political possibility, you know, what is deemed to be politically possible, seems to be getting narrower and narrower the more that Rachel Reeves morphs into Jeremy Hunt, and you know, when she was being interviewed on the radio this morning, I had to admit that she admitted that she agreed with very much of what he put forward, and this is really, really desperate stuff.
Desperate stuff, especially when you think about as you said, the impact on public services, not this year, well, it's bad enough already now, but when you track that out over the next 5 years, the impact on public services is completely astonishing.
Yeah.
And their hope must be that people won't be aware of that come the general election. So it'll be up to all of us to make sure that people are aware of that. So we probably won't pursue the growth story tonight, although it is a huge conundrum. Thank you for mentioning Seeing Green back in 1984, where I'm sorry to say I think I've devoted probably 3 chapters to the idiocy of persisting with limitless, year-on-year, exponential economic growth indefinitely into the future on a finite planet. As you said, it seemed insane back in 1984. It still seems completely insane now, but even beginning to challenge this kind of revealed truth is very, very difficult. So let's look at 1 or 2 things that might be a bit easier to challenge. And I'm so pleased you started by talking about Rosebank and about the government's policies on new oil and gas, which to a certain extent represent their inability any longer to have a properly thought through, consistent approach to net zero by 2050. Personally, I don't actually care very much about 2050. I'm really concerned about what governments are going to do by 2030 and by 2035, maybe 2040. So just to put it a little bit broader than just the oil and gas situation, on Saturday, so November the 18th, the world experienced, for the first time in recent history, well, first time since the Industrial Revolution, it experienced an average surface temperature around the world of 2 degrees centigrade higher than the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, as you mentioned, with all these conference of the parties, we've all been enjoined to focus on 1.5%, because if we can't limit the growth in temperatures to less than 1.5%, then all of these calamities come bearing down on us like a ravening pack of furies. And yet, on Saturday, and I can pretty much guarantee that you'd have to be a bit of a climate science following geek like me to know this. On Saturday, the average temperature was 2 degrees centigrade. Now, let's be careful here. It was an anomaly. It'll come back down. It'll probably mean that the 2023 hottest year ever forecast will be absolutely confirmed. But if you look at the surface temperature and you look at ocean temperatures, the whole climate system now is basically out of control. And yet, in the media and the wider discussion about this stuff, hardly anybody seems to understand the speed with which we are careering towards complete climate disaster. I don't mean just increasingly uncomfortable, I mean total full-on climate disaster. And this is a real problem for us, because unless people can get a sense of the urgency of this, they'll go along thinking, oh, well, yeah, we've got the North Sea oil and gas, that's fine. We might still have a bit more of that. It's okay. We've got till 2050. We're all going to be net zero by 2050, so that's fine, which is still the government's position.
Yep.
So for me, this inability to get across the urgency and these moments where suddenly you get these data points which are so shocking, and climate scientists are getting so worked up by the inability of politicians and the media to understand how shocking they are.
Yeah. I mean, I've just been really struck by how it really feels as if those climate scientists have run out of words.
They've run out of words.
They literally are saying now they don't know what adjectives to marshal to wake people up.
Well, my favorite is gobsmackingly bananas.
That was a good one.
That is a real, that's my go-to favorite from an American climatologist who is not given to abuse of the English language of that kind. But nonetheless, that's exactly the desperation they're in.
Yeah.
So it's extraordinary.
And when you add to that as well, I mean, it's not just necessarily needing to pick up those details, which I saw in your timeline. Actually, I didn't know until I was looking through your timeline earlier today on Twitter that you'd seen that bit of information about the 2 degrees. But I mean, you'd have thought that just the empirical reality of living through so many floods and heat waves and all of that, nature is doing a bloody good job, really, of making it fairly clear that so-called freak events are no longer freak, that these events that are supposed to happen once in 100 years are happening extremely regularly. And you do just wonder, what on earth is it going to take? It is so hard. But I suppose just coming back in a way to the first part of the conversation that we were having about, you know, if all of this is so blindingly obvious, then why isn't everybody voting green in droves? And I think we have to be really, really clear that there's a battle going on here, that there are, in other words, vested interests who are fighting just as hard as we are to push the opposite view, and that the fossil fuel industries are absolutely going to do everything they possibly can to give the impression that they're already dealing with the problem, that they're already, you know, investing loads in renewable energy, which is not true, and that everything is in hand. Or you've got the so-called Tufton Street organizations, you know, the Global Warming Policy Foundation and these these climate skeptic organisations, and it was really interesting because I was talking with Jim Ski the other day. Sorry, this is a British scientist who's now been appointed as the new head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we were having a conversation, first of all, about how I was saying that I felt that sort of climate skepticism in terms of denying the science had shifted now to people denying the policies. So the policies now are not proportionate in Rishi Sunak's term, and that the policies are going to be too expensive or they're going to be too radical or whatever. And I certainly think that's happening. I think there is a very deliberate campaign out there to try to portray these policies as somehow being unreasonable and anti-poor, even though the opposite is totally true. And the one that really got me most angry was when Rishi Sunak tried to say that the change that he made to the requirement on landlords to make sure that their properties met EPC standards, standard C, in other words, to make sure their properties were decent to rent out, he made it sound like he was doing a great favour to some of the poorest people by removing that requirement on landlords, which is simply going to mean that people are going to be living in colder, damp properties without any way of being able to challenge it. But anyhow, sorry, going back to Jim Ski, the point being that I was saying I thought that it had shifted now away from climate science scepticism to climate policy scepticism. But he said, which was worrying to me, that he said that's certainly happening, but he was hearing more of the science skepticism coming back again.
Yeah, it is coming back.
So each time you think you've won a battle, you can never think we've won that, we're moving on. It's constantly these other battles.
So with that backdrop, which we both share and suffer from, you can understand why more and more people are inclined to go beyond the current parliamentary and legal processes and to take direct action of one kind or another, particularly Just Stop Oil and others in that reinvented movement. I mean, direct action has always been part of the radical green movement anyway, but right now Extinction Rebellion was into that space for a while, has moved away from that now, but Just Stop Oil has stepped forward to fill that space. Your position on Just Stop Oil at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing to say about those young people in particular, because it is mostly young people who are going to be climbing up onto a gantry on the M25 and putting their own life at risk, is what an indictment of our system, that is the only way they think their voices can be heard. So I think, first of all, whatever you think about whatever tactic they might have chosen, I think the first point that I would start with is what is it about our current system which means that they don't feel that their voices can be heard in any way, any other way. In terms of whether or not, throwing soup at Van Gogh or climbing up gantries is a good way of advancing this agenda, I think the truth is, I mean, speaking for myself anyway, I genuinely don't know what's going to work best. And I am certainly not going to sit in judgment on people who think that that might be part of the answer. I worry about it because I worry that the conversation then becomes about the tactics, not the actual issue that they are concerned about. And speaking personally, when I've taken direct action and indeed was arrested for it and after a week's trial acquitted, I found it much easier to do that because the action I was taking, which was sitting outside a fracking site in Bolcombe, was somehow much more, I think, understandable. There was a narrative, there was a literacy to it in a way. There is this nasty fracking site that's going to massively increase climate emissions, and here am I trying to use my body to stop the people accessing that site. I feel that personally, if I'm going to get involved, that kind of connection works better. But I'm certainly not going to sit in judgment on people who take a different view, because we generally don't know. In 30 years' time, we will hopefully reconvene and look back and see what worked. And we don't know. And I'm interested too, of course, we always look back at the different examples in history of where direct action has or hasn't worked, and the suffragettes is the first one going back in a way in this country that we might think of. And these same debates were happening, as you know, at the time then between the suffragists and the suffragettes, and the suffragists were really cross that the suffragettes kept setting fire to post boxes and breaking people's windows, and is that going to help? And yet now I think quite a lot of analysis would suggest that the suffragettes did play an important role. we can discuss, we don't know, but I'm certainly not going to try to dissuade someone who feels sufficiently strongly that that is the way that they want to try and catch people's attention.
Yeah. No, well, as you know, I agree with you on that. I'm drifting more and more to supporting Just Stop Oil and organizations like that, because I think without that corrective in the system, the sense that the rest of the climate and environment movement has got it sorted, when we so obviously haven't got it sorted, is worrying, and too many people take that for granted. I know probably Daniel's going to... can I just ask one final question? No, but why don't you come up anyway, because that'll make me shut up.
Because otherwise we're not going to get these
no,
lovely
I
people
agree,
doing
exactly.
it.
So final question. You sort of glossed over the fact that you're stepping down at the general election. You mentioned Sian Berry as your successor, hopefully, but certainly your successor as candidate in Brighton, and hopefully successor as MP in Brighton. The Green Party is mourning, as you know, Caroline, with you leaving. I just want to say that in case you haven't spotted that there is a sense of, oh my God, what are we going to do without Caroline? So I just want to say that because you have been the beacon for everything that the Green Party stands for. So, yep. Oh, I can't be bothered with the question. Just go.
Listen, I'm sure
That was the sort of story.